I got back into comics that year I lived in America. As you say, it's funny, I didn't even mention that. That's the year, as I was waiting for my American visa, I picked up Watchmen from a shop in Oxford Street in London and read it from cover to cover whilst waiting for my visa.
Wow.
Then I went to America, lived there, and in my flat I was staying with no TV. So I was trapped in this room for a week, until I had any form of entertainment. And I basically just read Watchmen again and again and again because I had no access to anything else. And that's when, and this, of course, so I even from right in the beginning, I was very interested in Watchmen as a piece of art, as a formless statement. So this is kind of my, comics are interesting. And I didn't really get fully into comics circa 2000. When Alan Moore was doing the ABC books, and that was enough. I heard from a friend about I thought, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, that sounds interesting. So I started going to actual comic shops. That led me to a lot of, this led me to a bunch of stuff, eventually to the Warren Ellis's books, the Warren Ellis Forum, and then the comics internet. And so I went rapidly from somebody who didn't know anything about comics to my first Comic Con. And I wrote my first Comic Con, my first Comic Con was like 6 months after I got into this stuff. And I wrote my first script that night when I came home drunk. It wasn't polished or anything, but I wrote the basics. But sort of I came in late. I came in as an adult, and I came with somebody who's interested in formalism. I specifically, I was interested in writing comics because what can comics do? And so we do all my early work. We do bits of early. So I'm doing lots of stuff in the British small press, web comics, all manner of like.
Can you talk about that for a second? Because I think that.
Cool. No. We
don't have to.
This is also detailed, as in like. And so I'm remembering we're heading towards music and comics. This is our journey here. My earliest work were like, I remember writing this book. I wrote that short story I mentioned, Hit. It was called Hit. And this little 5-page comic, Can I Write a Comic? And it's basically 9-panel grid about a guy being hit by a car. And as his head is hitting the floor, he's losing each part of his sensory brain. So the narrative changes, so you lose different parts of consciousness. So it's like, I say it's experimental. It's not very experimental, but what it is it's how can I tell this sort of story in comics? And in 5 pages and do it like this.
I think that's very experimental. I mean, I'm presuming, let me interject, I apologize, but it's like, have you read Understanding Comics at this point?
Yes. Oh, that's worth mentioning. Understanding Comics was like, the other thing was living in America, that Watchmen thing, the role-playing people I hung out with, one of them was a big comics guy. And he lent me long boxes of Vertigo stuff. And he actually brought me Understanding Comics as a present, I think.
Wow.
And that's kind of like, you know what I mean? That was one of my kind of, since it was a year when I had very little social life, it was like all manner of stuff I went through. But it's like, I always remember like the Hellblazer, the Invisibles, Preacher. And of course, when I came back, when I came out of the year, I was like I was now like a 1 or 2 trade a year guy. You know, that kind of person who buys 1 album a year. I was that person. And it was whatever Preacher trade, whatever Invisibles trade. But I was aware that, comics are something which are interesting. I remember like working bars, and I actually did working on this 9-panel grid idea on a beer mat, that kind of, so it was in my head. I was comics curious.
I wonder if it's interesting because your interest in music with sort of, so between Watchmen being so gigantic and the 9-panel grid, which is so distinctive, and in particular the way that time is used, and sort of there's so much formalism with how the camera moves forward or to the side, or like there's a whole, I know my alma mater, University of Texas, used to teach Watchmen, but there's a lot to it. On top of that, then you have that deconstructed for you in Understanding Comics, so it gives you a more sort of clear vocabulary for that. And I think about, there is so much formalism in music, and it's there from inception. Like the minute that you as a kid can hear the bass line and you realize there's a bass line, or even more superficially when you realize there's drums, because that's kind of one of the first musical experiences that people have, right? And so to me, it's like being able to separate these things out in different particulate parts, you know, that's a key to music, and especially to writing about music. And then you're encountering, you know, one of the most formal, on a formalist basis, one of the most sophisticated pieces. And then you're getting understanding comics, which can make you break that down and sort of take your analytical mind to what is intuitively so powerful and kind of give you that vocabulary. Sorry, it's just, that's feels nuclear.
Absolutely. It's like this is, I came to comics with the critic, especially because I was, you know, I talk about being a reviewer and whatever. I was a critic. In like, I always remember my favorite, some of my favorite compliments or insults. I remember this one kid on a forum saying, "Oh, KIERON GILLEN, he's that reviewer who writes like he's a critic." Ugh, critics. And I'm like, I'll take it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a point of view.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this follows all the way from my comics. As in, I used to I think I'm better at it now. But there is a certain like intellectual coldness to some of the stuff I do, like because the fact I don't do stuff by accident. You know, I think
more
things
analytical.
through. You know, I am that person who bringing a tool, and I'm often, even my stories are structured like arguments. Like I do thesis, counter thesis, synthesis. You know, I'm very explicitly. I mean, Phonogram is basically music journalism in the form of a fantasy story. Like you get all these arguments. These arguments all seem kind of convincing, but they are all false. And eventually, the story will come to the story itself, but how everything integrates will express how I really feel without ever actually stating it. So those sort of skill sets that I think like a critic is always there, and I can't really avoid it. Which I quite, you know, I wouldn't want to avoid it because as we said earlier, your voice is you. You know, it's that kind of you definitely hit an age when you realise, not even an age, it doesn't really matter who dislikes you as long as enough people like you. Because we live in a medium where, you know, if 10,000 people love what you do and the rest of the human race despise you, you can eat. If the whole human race kind of likes you and no one's willing to pay for you, you can't eat.
Yeah.
You know, there's a kind of like, there's the awfulness of when you want to be an artist, when you want to be a work, when you want to live from your art is a better way of putting it. That's a tricky thing to say. So this is also skipping ahead a bit, but like when I got to the point of doing Phonogram, I was working with something else at the time. This kind of like much more generic comic. It was like it was a supernatural SAS sort of comic. You know, everyone's got one of them, and we'd actually been accepted from a publisher, me and this artist, and it was fun and it was political, and I liked it, and there's still some good ideas in it. But actually, it was Alex DeCampi, who said, "Are you sure you want this to be your first comic?"
Wow.
And which is cruel, but and it did make me go, "Well, yeah, she's right." And then I threw everything into Phonogram in that kind of like, Phonogram is such a very, Phonogram would not, no one would think Phonogram's a good idea except for possibly me, maybe Jamie. I'm not sure about Jamie. But you know what I mean? As in like Phonogram is very clearly a big burst of somebody who has something to say in comics. It doesn't matter if it's any good or not. It's that kind of like, you know,
right.
You know, like
we want voice.
Yeah, something I often say about Phonogram is, I don't know if it's good, but I know it's clever.
Well, I can allay that suspicion. It is good.